A 7-year-old girl was dragged straight from the cemetery gates by her stepmother and her accomplice. Still wearing her black funeral dress, tears streaming down her face as they threw her into the cold Chicago street. She clutched her father's old pocket watch tightly, her small body shaking not from the autumn wind, but from the cruel words that had just shattered her world. Then suddenly, a silver Mercedes screeched to a halt. A powerful man leaped out, and with one thunderous sentence, he would turn this nightmare into the beginning of justice. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching story of betrayal and redemption, take a moment to reflect on how you're feeling right now. Sometimes the most powerful stories find us exactly when we need them most. If this tale moves you, share your thoughts below. Your words might be the light someone else desperately needs today. The iron gates of Graceland Cemetery creaked shut behind the small funeral procession that had just laid James Turner to rest. The October sky hung heavy over Chicago, matching the weight in 7-year-old Sophie Turner's heart as she pressed her father's silver pocket watch against her chest. It was the only piece of him she had left now. The final gift he'd managed to slip into her tiny hands during his last moments in the hospital bed. "Stop sniffling, you ungrateful child," Victoria Turner hissed, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into Sophie's thin shoulder. At 34, Victoria was a stunning woman with platinum blonde hair and sharp green eyes that could freeze blood when she chose. She had married James Turner only 18 months ago, swooping into their lives like a beautiful storm when James was at his most vulnerable after losing his first wife. Sophie tried to muffle her sobs, but the tears wouldn't stop. Her father, the man who used to read her bedtime stories, who taught her to ride a bicycle in Lincoln Park, who promised he would always protect her, was gone forever. The funeral had been brief and cold, with only a handful of people present. Victoria had insisted on a private ceremony, though Sophie later learned it was because Victoria hadn't wanted to spend money on a proper service. "Daddy said he'd always watch over me," Sophie whispered, clutching the pocket watch tighter. Victoria's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Well, your precious daddy isn't here anymore, is he? And now you're my responsibility, though God knows I never asked for such a burden." Marcus Turner, Victoria's older brother, emerged from behind a large memorial stone where he'd been smoking a cigarette. He was a thin, wiry man in his 40s with calculating eyes and hands that were never quite clean. Marcus had moved in with them shortly after the wedding, claiming he needed a place to get back on his feet. But Sophie had noticed how he whispered with Victoria late at night when they thought she was asleep. "The lawyer called," Marcus said, dropping his cigarette and grinding it under his heel. "Reading of the will is scheduled for next week. Everything should transfer to you, as the surviving spouse, Victoria. The house, the business, everything." Victoria's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Perfect. James was always too soft-hearted for his own good, but at least he was generous in death. Sophie looked up at them, confusion mixing with her grief. "What about me?" Daddy said. "I would always have a home." Victoria knelt down until she was eye level with Sophie, her smile as cold as winter wind off Lake Michigan. "Oh sweetheart, things change when people die. Your father made some very poor financial decisions before he passed. The truth is, there's barely enough money left to keep the house running. We might have to make some adjustments." But Sophie could see the expensive designer dress Victoria wore, the new diamond bracelet on her wrist that hadn't been there before the funeral. Something didn't feel right, though she was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening. They drove home in Marcus's beat-up pickup truck. Sophie squeezed between her stepmother and uncle, the smell of cigarettes and cheap cologne making her stomach turn. The Turner family home, a beautiful Victorian house in Lincoln Park that James had bought when he was still married to Sophie's mother, came into view as they turned onto their tree-lined street. But instead of the warmth and comfort Sophie remembered, the house felt different now, colder, darker, as if her father's absence had drained all the life from it. "Go to your room," Victoria commanded as soon as they stepped inside. "And take off that dress. It's too expensive to be ruined by a careless child." Sophie climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her room, which had once been her sanctuary filled with books and stuffed animals, now felt like a prison cell. She carefully hung up her funeral dress and changed into an old pair of jeans and a faded sweater that had belonged to her mother. Downstairs, she could hear Victoria and Marcus talking in hushed but urgent tones. Sophie crept to the top of the stairs and strained to listen. "The will reading is just a formality," Victoria was saying. "James was so grief-stricken after his first wife died that he would have signed anything I put in front of him. That new will I had him sign last month should hold up in court." "What about the kid?" Marcus asked. "She's still his blood. She's 7 years old. What's she going to do? Hire a lawyer?" Victoria laughed. "Besides, I have plans for her. A child can be quite useful if you know how to motivate them properly." Sophie's blood ran cold. She didn't fully understand what they were discussing, but she knew it wasn't good. She clutched her father's pocket watch tighter, as if it could somehow bring him back to protect her. That night, Sophie lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Victoria and Marcus moving around downstairs. She heard furniture being moved, boxes being packed, and hushed conversations that went late into the night. When she finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with her father's voice warning her to be strong, to be brave, and to never give up hope. She woke the next morning to Victoria shaking her roughly awake. "Get up, you lazy child. There's work to be done." Sophie rubbed her eyes, confused. "Work, but I have school today." Victoria's smile was sharp and unforgiving. "Not anymore. I've decided that school is a luxury we can no longer afford. From now on, you'll be earning your keep around here." But Daddy said education was the most important thing. The slap came so fast that Sophie didn't see it coming. Her cheek burned, and tears sprang to her eyes, but Victoria's cold stare warned her not to cry. "Your daddy is dead," Victoria said slowly, as if speaking to someone very simple. "And I am in charge now. You'll do as I say, when I say it, or you'll find yourself somewhere much worse than here. Do you understand?" Sophie nodded, too shocked and frightened to speak. This couldn't be the same woman who had been so kind and gentle when her father was alive. That woman had been an act, a performance designed to win James Turner's heart and fortune. Over the following days, Sophie's world crumbled piece by piece. Victoria enrolled her out of her private school, claiming financial hardship. Sophie's toys and books began disappearing, sold off to help with expenses. Her meals became smaller and less frequent, while Victoria and Marcus ate well and ordered expensive takeout. But the worst part was the work. Victoria seemed to take sadistic pleasure in finding the most difficult and degrading tasks for Sophie to perform. Scrubbing floors until her knees were raw. Cleaning windows with newspapers that left her hands black with ink. Washing dishes in water so hot it burned her small fingers. "A good work ethic builds character," Victoria would say whenever Sophie's strength seemed to flag. "Your father spoiled you terribly, but I'll fix that." Marcus was even worse. He would sit in James's old armchair, drinking beer and making crude comments while Sophie worked. Sometimes he would deliberately spill things on the floor she had just cleaned, or track mud through the house with his dirty boots, laughing as Sophie started the work all over again. "Look at that, Vicky," he would say, using his pet name for Victoria. "She's like our own little Cinderella. Except there's no fairy godmother coming to save this one." 2 weeks after the funeral, the will reading finally took place. Sophie wasn't allowed to attend, but she listened from her room as Victoria and Marcus returned home, their voices loud with celebration. "I told you it would work perfectly," Victoria was saying. The lawyer barely even questioned the new will. Poor grieving James, changing his will to ensure his loving wife would be taken care of. So tragic, so romantic. "What about the original will?" Marcus asked. "Burned, along with all the other paperwork that might have caused us problems. As far as anyone knows, James Turner died intestate, except for the will that leaves everything to me." Sophie felt something die inside her chest. Her father had been planning to protect her, but Victoria had stolen that protection away. Now she truly was alone in the world, trapped with two people who saw her as nothing more than free labor and a burden they wished they could discard. But Victoria wasn't done with her cruelty. That evening, as Sophie was serving dinner, she had cooked herself despite barely knowing how. Victoria made an announcement that chilled her to the bone. "Marcus and I have been discussing your future, Sophie. And we've decided that you need to contribute more to this household." Sophie set down the serving dish with shaking hands. "I've been doing everything you asked. Housework is just the beginning," Victoria said, cutting into her steak with savage precision. "You're old enough now to understand that nothing in life is free. Food, shelter, clothing, it all costs money, money that you're not contributing." "But I'm only 7, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Old enough to learn the value of hard work," Marcus chimed in, his mouth full of food. "There are plenty of kids your age who work to help their families. Paper routes, babysitting, helping in shops. You're just too spoiled to see it." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be helping Marcus with his ... business ventures. Nothing too difficult, just simple tasks that even a child can handle." Sophie didn't know what Marcus's business ventures were, but something in the way Victoria said it made her stomach twist with dread. She had seen the strange people who came to visit Marcus late at night, the way they spoke in whispers and looked over their shoulders. Whatever Marcus was involved in, it wasn't legal, and it definitely wasn't safe for a 7-year-old child. That night, alone in her room, Sophie held her father's pocket watch and made a silent promise. She would survive this. She would find a way to honor her father's memory and escape from Victoria and Marcus. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she would not let them destroy her spirit. The pocket watch ticked steadily in her small hands, and for a moment, Sophie could almost imagine it was her father's heartbeat, still protecting her from beyond the grave. She pressed it to her ear and whispered, "I won't give up, Daddy. I promise I won't give up." Outside her window, Chicago sprawled beneath a canopy of stars, vast and full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. Somewhere in that city was someone who would help her, someone who would see through Victoria's lies and fight for justice. Sophie didn't know it yet, but that someone was closer than she thought. 3 months had passed since James Turner's burial, and Sophie's life had descended into a nightmare she couldn't have imagined. Each morning brought new cruelties, new ways for Victoria and Marcus to strip away what remained of her childhood and dignity. But on this particular grey November day, something was about to change forever. The transformation of Sophie from cherished daughter to virtual slave had been systematic and brutal. Victoria had sold off most of her belongings, claiming they needed the money for household expenses while simultaneously buying herself new jewelry and expensive clothes. Sophie's beautiful bedroom, once filled with books and toys, had been stripped bare except for a thin mattress on the floor and a single worn blanket. "Get up, you worthless child." Victoria's shrill voice cut through the early morning darkness. "Marcus has worked for you today, and you're already late." Sophie struggled to her feet, her small body aching from sleeping on the hard floor. The October chill had given way to November's bitter cold, and the house's heating was mysteriously always turned down in Sophie's room, while the rest of the house remained comfortably warm. Marcus was waiting in the kitchen, his clothes rumpled and smelling of cigarettes and something else. Sophie couldn't identify something sharp and chemical that made her nose burn. Over the past few weeks, she had learned that Marcus was involved in activities that required a 7-year-old's small hands and innocent appearance. "Today, you're going to help Uncle Marcus with a very important job," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Some nice men are going to give you packages to deliver to other nice men. All you have to do is walk from one place to another. Even a stupid child like you can handle that." Sophie's stomach twisted with fear. She had seen movies on television before Victoria sold the set. She knew that children who delivered mysterious packages for adults were usually in terrible danger. But what choice did she have? Victoria had made it clear that if Sophie didn't cooperate, she would be thrown out onto the streets with nothing. "I don't want to," Sophie whispered, clutching her father's pocket watch. It was the only thing Victoria hadn't been able to sell. Sophie had hidden it so well that even Marcus's violent searches hadn't uncovered it. Victoria's face twisted with rage. She grabbed Sophie by the shoulders and shook her hard enough to make her teeth rattle. "You don't have a choice, you little brat. You'll do exactly what we tell you to do, or you'll find yourself in foster care with people who make us look like saints. Do you understand?" The threat of foster care had been Victoria's favorite weapon lately. She had filled Sophie's head with horror stories of children who were beaten, starved, and worse by their foster families. Whether these stories were true or not, they terrified Sophie into submission. "Now get dressed in your nicest clothes," Marcus ordered, stubbing out his cigarette on the kitchen counter. "You need to look like a good little girl from a nice family. Can't have you looking like the street rat you're becoming." Sophie's nicest clothes were now just a faded dress that had once been beautiful but was now too small and covered in patches. Victoria had sold all her good clothing months ago, but she put on the dress and tried to comb her tangled hair with her fingers, knowing that looking disheveled would only make things worse. The first delivery was to a warehouse on Chicago's South Side. Marcus drove her there in his pickup truck, chain-smoking and giving her explicit instructions about what to say and do. You walk up to the man in the blue jacket, you say, "Uncle Marcus sent me," and you give him the package. Then you walk away and wait for me in the truck. You don't ask questions, you don't look in the package, and you don't talk to anyone else. Got it? Sophie nodded, though her hands were shaking. The package was small and wrapped in brown paper, but it felt heavy in her tiny hands. Whatever was inside, she knew it wasn't anything good. The warehouse district was a maze of grimy buildings and empty lots filled with broken glass and rusted metal. Men lounged around the entrances of various buildings, their eyes hard and calculating as they watched Marcus's truck pull up. Sophie had never been to this part of Chicago before, and everything about it screamed danger. "Remember what I told you," Marcus said as Sophie climbed out of the truck. "Be quick, be quiet, and don't screw this up." The man in the blue jacket was exactly where Marcus said he would be, standing near a loading dock and checking his watch impatiently. He was tall and thin with cold eyes and hands that moved constantly, as if he couldn't keep still. When Sophie approached him, he looked down at her with surprise. "Uncle Marcus sent me," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man took the package and examined it carefully before nodding. "Tell your uncle the shipment is good. Next delivery is Thursday, same time." Sophie nodded and hurried back to the truck, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Marcus grinned when she climbed back in, and she could smell alcohol on his breath even though it was only 10 in the morning. "Good girl. See how easy that was. You're going to be very useful to Uncle Marcus." They made 3 more deliveries that day, each one in a different part of the city, each one more frightening than the last. By the time they returned home, Sophie felt sick to her stomach and couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She knew she had just become part of something terrible, something that would haunt her forever. Victoria was waiting for them with a cruel smile. "How did our little courier do on her first day?" "Like a natural," Marcus replied, counting a thick stack of bills. "Nobody suspects a sweet little girl. She's going to make us a lot of money." Sophie's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a one-time thing, they were planning to use her regularly. She was trapped in a nightmare with no way out, forced to participate in illegal activities that could get her killed or imprisoned. That night, lying on her mattress in the cold, empty room, Sophie pulled out her father's pocket watch and held it close to her heart. The steady ticking was the only thing that kept her from completely falling apart. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her father's voice, his laugh, the way he used to tuck her in at night and tell her stories. "I'm so sorry, Daddy," she whispered into the darkness. "I don't know how to be strong anymore." But her father's voice seemed to echo in her memory. "You're stronger than you know, little one. Sometimes we have to endure terrible things to get to the good things waiting for us." The deliveries continued for weeks. Sophie learnt the routes by heart, memorized the faces of the dangerous men she encountered, and developed a sixth sense for avoiding trouble. But each day took a little more of her innocence, a little more of her hope. Victoria and Marcus grew bolder in their cruelty as Sophie became more useful to them. They barely fed her now, claiming that a hungry child looked more pathetic and was less likely to attract unwanted attention. They moved her to the basement, saying her room was needed for Marcus's business associates, who sometimes needed a place to stay. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with spiders. Sophie could hear rats scurrying in the walls at night, and sometimes she woke up to find them watching her with glittering eyes. But even worse than the physical discomfort was the crushing loneliness and despair that threatened to swallow her whole. It was on a particularly bitter December day, with snow falling thick and fast outside, that Sophie's world changed forever. She had just completed another delivery, this one to a man who looked at her with such hunger in his eyes that she ran all the way back to Marcus's truck. Her shoes were soaked through, her thin coat provided no protection against the wind, and her fingers were so cold they had turned blue. "I want to go home," she said, as Marcus started the truck. Marcus laughed harshly. "Home? That's rich. You don't have a home anymore, kid. You've got a place to sleep and work to do. That's all you get." But as they drove through Lincoln Park, past the beautiful houses where normal families lived normal lives, Sophie saw something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. A black Mercedes had pulled up in front of the Turner house, and a tall man in an expensive suit was walking up the front steps. "Who's that?" Sophie asked, pressing her face to the truck window. Marcus squinted through the snow. "Probably another one of Victoria's marks. She's been working on landing a rich husband to replace your old man." But something about the man's posture, the way he carried himself, reminded Sophie of her father. There was strength there, confidence, and something else, something that made her think of the word justice, even though she couldn't explain why. When they arrived at the house, Victoria was in a state of panic. She had changed into her most elegant dress and was applying makeup with shaking hands. "Where have you been?" she snapped at Marcus. "Alexander Stone is here, and I wasn't ready." "Do you know who Alexander Stone is? He's only one of the richest men in Chicago. Real estate empire, connections everywhere, more money than God himself." Sophie's ears perked up at the name. Alexander Stone. She had heard her father mention that name once, a long time ago, when he was talking on the phone about business. The conversation had been brief, but she remembered her father saying something about a good man in a corrupt world. "What does he want?" Marcus asked, suddenly interested. "James mentioned him in some old paperwork I found. Apparently, they did business together years ago. Stone is asking questions about James's death, about how I'm managing things, about..." Victoria's eyes flicked toward Sophie with undisguised hatred about the child. Sophie felt something flutter in her chest, something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. If this Alexander Stone had been her father's business partner, maybe he would remember her. Maybe he would see what Victoria and Marcus were doing to her. Maybe, just maybe, he would help. "Get the brat cleaned up," Victoria ordered Marcus. "If Stone wants to see her, she needs to look like a well-cared-for child, not the little street urchin she's become." For the first time in weeks, Sophie was allowed to take a hot bath and put on clean clothes. Victoria even let her eat a proper meal, though she warned her that any word about their family business would result in punishment worse than anything Sophie could imagine. "You tell Mr. Stone that you're happy here," Victoria said, gripping Sophie's chin so hard it left marks. "You tell him that Marcus and I take excellent care of you, that you love us very much, and that everything is wonderful. If you say anything else, anything at all, I will make sure you disappear somewhere no one will ever find you. Do you understand?" Sophie nodded, but inside her heart was racing. This was her chance, maybe her only chance to get help. She just had to be smart about it. Had to find a way to communicate the truth without Victoria and Marcus realizing what she was doing. Alexander Stone was waiting in the living room when Sophie was brought down to meet him. He was tall and imposing, with silver-grey hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see everything. His suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to being in control. But it was his eyes that caught Sophie's attention. They were kind eyes, intelligent eyes, and when they looked at her, she felt seen for the first time in months. "Sophie," he said, his voice deep and warm. "I'm Alexander Stone. I was a friend of your father's." Victoria quickly inserted herself between them. "Mr. Stone, as you can see, Sophie is doing wonderfully. She's adjusted so well to our little family. Haven't you, sweetheart?" Sophie looked up at Alexander Stone and felt her father's pocket watch pressing against her chest where she had hidden it under her clothes. The man's eyes were patient, watchful, and something in them reminded her so much of her father that she almost cried. "Yes," she said quietly, sticking to Victoria's script. "Everything is wonderful." But as she spoke, she slowly reached up and touched the place where the pocket watch was hidden. It was a small gesture, one that Victoria and Marcus wouldn't notice, but she hoped, prayed, that Alexander Stone would understand its significance. His eyes flickered to her hand, then back to her face, and she saw something change in his expression. A sharpening, a sudden intensity that made her heart race with hope. "I'm very glad to hear that," he said carefully. "Your father spoke of you often. He was very proud of you." "James was a wonderful man," Victoria said quickly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "We all miss him terribly. But Sophie has been such a comfort to us, haven't you, dear?" Sophie nodded again, but this time she let her sleeve fall back slightly, revealing the rope burn marks on her wrist from the day Marcus had tied her up as punishment for dropping one of his packages. It was just for a second, but Alexander Stone's eyes caught it immediately. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when he looked at Victoria and Marcus, there was something in his gaze that made them both take an involuntary step backward. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, I should be going. But I want you to know, Sophie, that if you ever need anything at all, you can call me." He handed her a business card, his fingers briefly touching hers, "Day or night. Do you understand?" Sophie took the card with trembling hands, memorizing every detail of his face. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Victoria snatched the card away as soon as Alexander Stone left. "You won't be needing that," she said, tearing it into pieces. "Mr. Stone is a very busy man. He doesn't have time for little girls and their problems." But Sophie had already memorized the phone number, and more importantly, she had seen the look in Alexander Stone's eyes when he noticed her injuries. He knew. Somehow he knew what was happening to her. That night, for the first time in months, Sophie fell asleep with a smile on her face. Help was coming. She could feel it in her bones, in the steady ticking of her father's pocket watch, in the memory of Alexander Stone's kind eyes. She didn't know it yet, but her nightmare was about to end. Because Alexander Stone was not the kind of man who walked away from a child in danger. And when he moved with the force of justice itself. Alexander Stone didn't sleep that night. Instead, he paced the marble floors of his penthouse office in downtown Chicago, his mind racing with images of Sophie Turner's hollow eyes and the rope burns on her tiny wrist. Every instinct he had developed over 40 years of business and 15 years of charity. Work screamed that the child was in immediate danger. By dawn, he had made 3 phone calls. The first was to his private investigator, Marcus Reynolds, a former FBI agent who specialized in cases involving missing persons and child welfare. The second was to his attorney, Patricia Wu, one of Chicago's most feared family law specialists. The third was to Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric psychologist who had consulted on several of Alexander's foundation cases. "I need everything you can find on Victoria Turner and her brother Marcus," Alexander told Reynolds over the phone. "Financial records, criminal history, associates, everything. And I need it fast. There's a child's life at stake." Reynolds had worked for Alexander long enough to recognize the steel in his voice. "How fast are we talking, Mr. Stone?" 48 hours. Use whatever resources you need. Money is no object. Alexander's fortune had been built on real estate development. But his reputation had been built on something far more valuable: his word. When Alexander Stone made a promise, it was kept. When he declared war on corruption and injustice, he won. And right now, he was declaring war on whoever was hurting James Turner's daughter. The investigation began immediately. Reynolds started with public records while his team of specialists dug into the darker corners of Victoria and Marcus's lives. What they found painted a picture so ugly that even Reynolds, who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, was shocked. Victoria Turner had a criminal record dating back to her teenage years: fraud, theft, prostitution, drug possession. She had worked her way up from small-time grifter to sophisticated con artist. Her marriage to James Turner hadn't been love. It had been a carefully planned operation designed to separate a grieving widower from his fortune. Marcus Turner was even worse. Prison records showed multiple convictions for drug trafficking, assault, and child endangerment. He had been suspected in the disappearance of 2 children from his previous neighborhood, though charges were never filed due to lack of evidence. His current activities included running drugs through Chicago's South Side, using children as couriers. "Jesus Christ," Reynolds muttered as he compiled the report. "They're using the kid as a drug mule." The medical records were the most damning evidence. Dr. Martinez examined the photographs Reynolds had managed to take discreetly during a surveillance operation, and her diagnosis was immediate and terrifying. "This child shows classic signs of severe abuse and malnutrition," she told Alexander during an emergency meeting. "The rope burns, the weight loss, the fearful posture. She's living in a constant state of terror. Mr. Stone, if we don't get her out of that house immediately, I'm not sure she'll survive much longer." Alexander's jaw clenched as he studied the photographs. Sophie looked like a ghost of the vibrant child James had described in their business meetings years ago. Her clothes hung loose on her skeletal frame, her eyes were sunken and hollow, and she carried herself like someone expecting a blow at any moment. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Days, maybe weeks. Children are resilient, but there are limits. The psychological damage alone could take years to heal, if it can be healed at all." That was all Alexander needed to hear. He stood up, straightened his tie, and made a decision that would change Sophie's life forever. "Patricia, prepare an emergency custody petition. I want it filed within the hour. Marcus, I need concrete evidence of drug trafficking and child endangerment, and I need it today." "Mr. Stone," Patricia Wu said carefully, "you have to understand that the courts move slowly in these cases. Victoria is the legal guardian, and unless we can prove immediate physical danger, then we'll prove it." Alexander interrupted. "I'm not leaving that child in that house for one more night." The plan they devised was risky but necessary. Reynolds would conduct surveillance while wearing a wire and recording equipment. They would document the illegal activities, the abuse, and hopefully catch Victoria and Marcus in the act of endangering Sophie. Meanwhile, Alexander would use his considerable influence to expedite the court proceedings. But Victoria and Marcus weren't sitting idle. They had noticed Alexander's visit and recognized the threat he represented. That evening, as Sophie huddled in the cold basement trying to sleep, they were upstairs planning something that would eliminate their problem permanently. "He knows," Victoria said, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "I saw the way he looked at her, the way he noticed her wrist. That sanctimonious bastard is going to try to take her away." Marcus was counting the day's drug money, his movements sharp and agitated. "So we get rid of her. Problem solved." "Get rid of her? How, you idiot? If she disappears right after Alexander Stone's visit, we'll be the first suspects. We need to be smarter than that." Marcus grinned, revealing yellow tobacco-stained teeth. "I've got contacts who specialize in making children disappear. Kids who are never found, never traced. They end up in places where nobody asks questions and nobody comes looking." Victoria stopped pacing, her eyes lighting up with cruel calculation. "How much?" $5,000 up front, $5,000 when it's done. By tomorrow night, the little Brett will be on her way to somewhere very far from Chicago. Somewhere Alexander Stone's money can't reach." Sophie, lying on her thin mattress in the basement, heard every word through the heating vents. Her blood turned to ice as she realized they weren't just planning to get rid of her. They were planning to sell her to people who would make Victoria and Marcus look like saints. She pressed her father's pocket watch to her chest and made a decision that terrified her. She had to escape. Tonight, before they could carry out their plan. But first, she had to try to call Alexander Stone. Victoria had torn up his business card, but Sophie had memorized the number. The problem was getting to a phone without being caught. The house had 3 phones, one in the kitchen, one in Victoria's bedroom, and one in the living room where Marcus was currently counting money. Sophie waited until she heard Marcus go to the bathroom, then crept up the basement stairs as quietly as she could. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold wooden floors as she made her way to the kitchen. Her heart was pounding so loud she was sure it would wake the entire neighborhood. But she forced herself to move slowly and carefully. The kitchen phone hung on the wall next to the refrigerator. Sophie lifted the receiver with shaking hands and dialed the number she had memorized. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Stone Industries. This is the emergency line. Sophie almost cried with relief. Please, I need to talk to Mr. Alexander Stone. This is Sophie Turner, and I'm in terrible danger. Hold on, Miss Turner. Mr. Stone left explicit instructions that any call from you was to be put through immediately. There was a brief pause, then Alexander's deep, reassuring voice came on the line. Sophie, are you all right? Where are you? I'm at home, but they're going to sell me, Sophie whispered urgently. Victoria and Marcus are going to give me 2 bad people tomorrow night, and I won't ever come back. Please, you have to help me. Alexander's voice became sharp with urgency. Sophie, listen to me very carefully. Are you somewhere safe right now? I'm in the kitchen, but if they catch me, the sound of footsteps on the stairs made Sophie's blood freeze. Marcus was coming back downstairs. I have to go, she whispered into the phone. Please don't forget about me, Sophie, wait. She hung up the phone just as Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. His eyes narrowed suspiciously as he looked at her standing by the phone. What are you doing up here, Brett? Sophie's mind raced. I was thirsty. I came up to get some water. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. Get your water and get back downstairs. And if I catch you wandering around the house again, you'll regret it. Sophie filled a glass with water, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. As she passed Marcus, he grabbed her arm roughly. You know what happens to little girls who don't mind their own business, don't you? His breath smelled like alcohol and cigarettes, and his grip left bruises on her thin arm. They disappear, and nobody ever finds them. Sophie nodded, too terrified to speak. But inside, hope was burning bright. Alexander Stone had heard her. He knew about the danger. All she had to do was survive until he could help her. She didn't have to wait long. Alexander had immediately called Reynolds and Patricia Wu after Sophie's desperate phone call. Within 30 minutes, they had assembled a team that included 2 off-duty police officers, a child welfare specialist, and a medical technician. The emergency custody order had been expedited through a sympathetic judge who owed Alexander a favor from a previous charitable contribution. We go in hard and fast, Alexander told his team as they gathered outside the Turner house. The child is in immediate danger, and we have legal authority to remove her. Reynolds, you and the officers handle Victoria and Marcus. Patricia, you serve the papers. Dr. Martinez, you assess the child's condition. I'll stay with Sophie and make sure she's safe. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and snow was beginning to fall as they approached the house. Alexander could see lights on in the living room and shadows moving behind the curtains. His heart was pounding, not from fear for himself, but from fear that they might already be too late. Reynolds positioned the officers at the back door while Alexander and Patricia approached. The front Alexander's knock was firm and authoritative, the knock of a man accustomed to having doors opened for him. Victoria answered, still dressed in her expensive outfit, but with her makeup smeared and her hair disheveled. When she saw Alexander, her face went pale. Mr. Stone, what are you doing here so late? We're here for Sophie, Alexander said simply, pushing past her into the house. Patricia followed, already unfolding the legal documents. Victoria Turner, you are hereby served with an emergency custody order removing Sophie Turner from this home immediately due to credible reports of abuse and endangerment. Victoria's mask of civility finally cracked completely. "You can't do this. She's my stepdaughter. I have legal rights. Your rights ended the moment you started using a 7-year-old child as a drug courier," Alexander said coldly. "Where is she?" Marcus appeared from the living room, his eyes wild with panic and rage. "You have no right to be in this house. Get out." Reynolds stepped forward, flanked by the 2 police officers. "Marcus Turner, you're under arrest for child endangerment, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking." The next few minutes were chaos. Marcus tried to run but was tackled by one of the officers before he reached the back door. Victoria screamed threats and accusations, claiming Alexander was kidnapping Sophie for his own perverted purposes. But Alexander ignored it all, focused only on finding the child who had called him for help. "Sophie," he called out. "It's Alexander Stone. You're safe now." A muffled sound came from somewhere below them. The basement. Alexander found the basement door and yanked it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The smell that rose from below made his stomach turn dampness, mold, and the unmistakable odor of human misery. "Sophie, are you down there?" A small voice answered from the darkness. "Mr. Stone, is it really you?" "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here, come on up, you're safe now." Sophie emerged from the basement like a ghost, her thin nightgown torn and dirty, her feet bare despite the cold. When she saw Alexander, she broke into tears and threw herself into his arms. "I knew you would come," she sobbed against his chest. "Daddy told me you were a good man, and I knew you would come." Alexander lifted her gently, shocked at how light she was. She couldn't weigh more than 40 pounds, barely half what a healthy 7-year-old should weigh. Her arms and legs were covered in bruises, old and new, and when he touched her forehead, she was burning with fever. "Dr. Martinez," he called urgently. "I need you down here now." The pediatric psychologist took one look at Sophie and immediately began her assessment. Severe malnutrition, signs of physical abuse, possible pneumonia. "We need to get her to a hospital immediately." "No," Sophie cried, clinging to Alexander's shirt. "Please, don't leave me alone. They said they were going to sell me to bad people tonight." Alexander's jaw clenched with rage, but his voice remained gentle. "No one is ever going to hurt you again, Sophie. I promise you that. You're coming home with me, and you'll never have to see these people again." Victoria, now handcuffed and being led to a police car, screamed one final threat. "This isn't over, Stone. That brat belongs to me. You'll pay for this." Alexander wrapped his coat around Sophie and carried her to his car, shielding her from Victoria's venomous words. As they drove toward the hospital, Sophie curled up in his arms like a frightened kitten. "Mr. Stone," she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart. I still have Daddy's pocket watch. They never found it. I hid it where they couldn't take it away." She pulled the silver watch from inside her nightgown, its surface tarnished but still ticking steadily. Alexander felt his heart break and heal at the same time. "Your father would be so proud of you, Sophie. You were braver than any grown-up I've ever known. Will you help me wind it?" "Daddy taught me how, but my hands are too shaky right now." Alexander took the watch and carefully wound it, the familiar clicking sound filling the car. "There, good as new." Sophie smiled for the first time in months. "Just like me." Alexander kissed the top of her head gently. "Even better than new, sweetheart. Even better than new." As Chicago's lights blurred past the car windows, Sophie finally felt safe enough to fall asleep. The nightmare was over. Justice had arrived in the form of a kind man with gentle hands and a fierce heart, just as her father had promised it would. Victoria and Marcus Turner were going to prison for a very long time, and Sophie was going home with someone who would love and protect her the way her father had always wanted. The pocket watch ticked steadily against her chest, keeping time with her healing heart. 6 months had passed since that frozen December night when Alexander Stone rescued Sophie Turner from the basement of horrors that Victoria and Marcus had created. The transformation that had taken place in both their lives during those months was nothing short of miraculous, though the journey to healing had been neither quick nor easy. The first few weeks had been the most challenging. Sophie, despite being safe in Alexander's sprawling Lakeshore Drive penthouse, continued to wake up screaming from nightmares. She flinched whenever anyone raised their voice, hoarded food under her bed, and refused to sleep anywhere but on the floor of Alexander's study where she could see the door at all times. Dr. Sarah Martinez had warned Alexander that the healing process would be long and complex. "She's been through trauma that would break most adults," she had explained during one of their weekly sessions. The physical abuse was terrible, but the psychological damage runs much deeper. Sophie learned that the adults who were supposed to protect her were actually predators. That's a betrayal that shakes the very foundation of trust. Alexander had approached Sophie's recovery the same way he approached everything in his life, with patience, determination, and unlimited resources. He hired the best trauma therapists in Chicago, converted one wing of his penthouse into a child-friendly space complete with toys, books, and art supplies, and took a leave of absence from his business to focus entirely on Sophie's needs. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the rescue, during a particularly difficult therapy session. Sophie had been having flashbacks about the drug deliveries Marcus had forced her to make, and she was convinced that the police were going to arrest her for being a criminal. "I carried the bad packages," she sobbed to Dr. Martinez while Alexander held her gently. "I gave them to the scary men. I'm a bad person and I should go to jail." Alexander felt his heart break as he listened to the 7-year-old blame herself for crimes committed by adults. He knelt down until he was eye level with Sophie, his voice firm but gentle. "Sophie, look at me. What Victoria and Marcus made you do was not your fault. You were a little girl trying to survive. The only criminals in this story are the adults who hurt you and used you. You are not bad. You are not a criminal. You are a brave, wonderful little girl who survived something terrible, and now you're safe." For the first time since the rescue, Sophie looked directly into Alexander's eyes without flinching. "Do you really think I'm brave?" "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met," Alexander replied, without hesitation. "Your father would be so proud of the strength you showed, and I'm proud to know you." That night, Sophie asked if she could sleep in a real bed instead of on the floor. It was the first sign that she was beginning to trust that her safety was real and permanent. The legal proceedings against Victoria and Marcus had moved swiftly, thanks in large part to Alexander's connections and the overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Marcus Turner was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for drug trafficking, child endangerment, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. Victoria Turner received 15 years for fraud, child abuse, and accessory to trafficking charges, but perhaps more importantly for Sophie's healing, the investigation had uncovered evidence that completely exonerated her from any wrongdoing. Detective Lisa Chen, who had led the case, made a special visit to explain to Sophie that she was considered a victim and a witness, not a perpetrator. "The bad men who took the packages from you are in jail too," Detective Chen told Sophie during a gentle interview. "You helped us catch them by being so brave and telling us the truth. You're a hero, not a criminal." The custody proceedings had been more complex. Alexander had initially been granted emergency guardianship, but transforming that into permanent custody required extensive legal maneuvering. Victoria's parental rights had to be formally terminated. Sophie's extended family had to be located and interviewed, and child services had to conduct thorough evaluations of Alexander's fitness as a guardian. The process revealed some surprising information about Sophie's background. Her maternal grandparents, whom Victoria had claimed were dead, were actually alive and living in Portland, Oregon. They had been searching for Sophie ever since Victoria had cut off all contact after James's death. Margaret and Robert Chen, Sophie's mother, had been half Chinese, half Chishish, which explained Sophie's distinctive features, flew to Chicago as soon as they learned their granddaughter was alive. The reunion was emotional and complicated, as Sophie had no memory of them from her early childhood. "We wanted to take her after James died," Margaret Chen explained to Alexander during a difficult family meeting. "We hired lawyers, tried to contact Victoria, even drove to Chicago. But Victoria had moved, changed phone numbers, made it impossible to find them. We assumed she was protecting Sophie's privacy during their grief. The discovery of living grandparents created a custody dilemma. Legally, blood relatives typically had priority in custody decisions. But Sophie, when gently asked about her preferences, made her feelings clear. "I want to stay with Mr. Stone," she told the family court judge during a private interview. "My grandparents seem nice, but Mr. Stone saved me. He promised he would always keep me safe, and he kept his promise. I trust him." The judge, Patricia Coleman, was an experienced family court official who had seen every possible permutation of custody disputes. But even she was moved by the unusual circumstances of the case. "This is a child who has survived extraordinary trauma," Judge Coleman explained during the final hearing. "Her emotional stability and sense of security must be the primary consideration. While we absolutely want to facilitate a relationship with her maternal grandparents, disrupting her current placement could cause additional psychological harm. The solution they reached was both innovative and heartwarming." Alexander was granted permanent custody of Sophie, while her grandparents were given extensive visitation rights and a formal role in major decisions about her upbringing. Additionally, Alexander established a trust fund that would ensure the Chuns could visit Chicago regularly, and that Sophie could spend summers in Portland if she chose. "It's not conventional," Patricia Wu admitted after the hearing. "But this isn't a conventional case. What matters is that Sophie has multiple adults who love her and want what's best for her future." The healing process accelerated once the legal uncertainty was resolved. Sophie began attending a small private school that specialized in children who had experienced trauma. Her teacher, Ms. Rebecca Foster, was trained in recognizing and addressing the educational impacts of abuse and neglect. "Sophie is remarkably bright," Ms. Foster reported during a parent conference with Alexander. "She's reading at a high school level and shows exceptional aptitude for mathematics and science. The academic neglect she suffered has actually motivated her to learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible. It's as if she's trying to make up for lost time." But it was outside the classroom that Sophie's most dramatic progress occurred. Alexander had enrolled her in art therapy, music lessons, and swimming classes activities designed to help her rebuild her relationship with her own body and emotions. The art therapy, in particular, proved transformative. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the art therapist, explained the significance of Sophie's evolving artwork during a consultation with Alexander. "When Sophie first started, her drawings were all dark colors, closed spaces, frightened figures. Look at her most recent piece. The drawing showed a house with bright yellow windows, flowers in the front yard, and two figures, one tall, one small, holding hands in front of the door. The sky was blue with white clouds, and there was even a rainbow in the corner. This represents security, hope, family," Dr. Martinez continued. "She's beginning to envision a future where she's safe and loved. That's a crucial milestone in trauma recovery." The swimming lessons had an unexpected benefit beyond physical fitness. Sophie discovered she had a natural talent for the sport, and the rhythmic nature of lap swimming seemed to have a calming effect on her anxiety. Within 3 months, she was swimming competitively in the youth league at Alexander's athletic club. "There's something about being in the water that makes me feel free," Sophie explained to Alexander after a particularly good practice session. "It's like all the bad memories can't follow me there." Alexander, watching her glide through the pool with increasing confidence and grace, understood exactly what she meant. The water was clean, transparent, honest, everything her previous life with Victoria and Marcus had not been. The relationship between Sophie and her grandparents developed slowly but steadily. Margaret and Robert Chen were gentle, patient people who understood that rebuilding family bonds after trauma required time and delicacy. They visited Chicago once a month, bringing stories about Sophie's mother and photographs that helped her understand her heritage. "Your mother was a swimmer too," Margaret told Sophie during one visit, showing her a photo of a young woman in a high school swim team uniform. "She set several state records in the butterfly stroke. She was also incredibly kind, just like you." These conversations about her mother were initially difficult for Sophie, as they reminded her of everything Victoria and Marcus had stolen from her. But gradually, with Dr. Martinez's help, she began to see her mother's memory as a source of strength rather than pain. "Mummy would want me to be happy," Sophie concluded during one therapy session. "She would want me to swim fast and make friends and not be scared all the time." The first major test of Sophie's healing came during the 1-year anniversary of her father's death. Alexander had worried that the date would trigger a severe emotional setback, but Sophie surprised everyone with her maturity and resilience. "I want to visit Daddy's grave," she announced at breakfast that morning, "but not to be sad. I want to tell him about school and swimming and how you take good care of me now. I think he would like to know that I'm okay." They drove to Graceland Cemetery together, the same cemetery where Sophie's nightmare had begun a year earlier. But this time she walked through the gates holding Alexander's hand confidently, wearing a bright blue dress and carrying a bouquet of yellow roses, her father's favorite flowers. At James Turner's gravestone, Sophie knelt down and placed the flowers carefully. Then she began to talk, as naturally as if her father was sitting beside her. "Hi, Daddy. I brought Mr. Stone to meet you properly. He's taking really good care of me, just like you wanted. I'm learning to swim, and I can do a whole lap underwater now. I'm reading books about science and math, and I'm not scared to sleep in my bed anymore." Alexander stood nearby, giving Sophie privacy for this important conversation while staying close enough to provide support if needed. He watched as she pulled her father's pocket watch from her pocket and held it up to catch the sunlight. "I still wind your watch every day, just like you taught me. And I listen to it tick when I feel scared, and I remember that you loved me. Mr. Stone loves me too, now, and Grandma and Grandpa Chen. So I have lots of love to keep me strong." She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and turned to Alexander with a smile that transformed her entire face. "I'm ready to go home now." As they walked back through the cemetery, Sophie slipped her small hand into Alexander's large one. The gesture was natural, trusting, and permanent in a way that no legal document could ever match. "Thank you for saving me," she said quietly. Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for letting me." The formal adoption proceedings took place on a sunny morning in late spring, exactly 18 months after that terrible night in December. Judge Coleman, who had followed Sophie's case from the beginning, presided over the ceremony with obvious pleasure. "Sophie Turner," the judge said, smiling down at the 80-year-old girl who stood before her in a new white dress, "do you want Alexander Stone to be your legal father?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sophie replied clearly. "I want that very much. And Alexander Stone, do you promise to love, protect, and provide for Sophie Turner as your own daughter?" Alexander's voice was thick with emotion as he answered, "I do, Your Honor, for the rest of my life." "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Illinois, I hereby declare that Sophie Turner Stone is now your legal daughter. Congratulations to both of you." The courtroom erupted in applause from the small group of supporters who had gathered to witness the adoption. Dr. Martinez, Ms. Foster, Detective Chen, the grandparents, and several of Alexander's friends who had watched Sophie's transformation with amazement and joy. But the most emotional moment came when Sophie was handed the official adoption certificate. She studied it carefully, tracing her new name with her finger, Sophie Turner Stone. "Now it's real," she whispered to Alexander. "I'm really your daughter forever. You were my daughter the moment I decided to fight for you," Alexander whispered back. "This just makes it official." The celebration continued at Alexander's penthouse, where Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who had become like a grandmother to Sophie, had prepared a feast. The apartment was decorated with balloons and streamers, and there were gifts piled on the dining room table. But the most meaningful gift wasn't wrapped in paper. It was a framed photograph that Alexander had commissioned, a professional portrait of him and Sophie together, both of them smiling genuinely and happily. Underneath the photograph, engraved on a silver plate, were the words, "Family isn't always blood. It's the people in your life who want you in theirs." Sophie hugged the photograph to her chest and looked up at Alexander with eyes that sparkled with joy instead of fear. "Can we hang this next to Daddy's picture in my room?" "Of course we can, sweetheart. They can watch over you together." As the celebration continued around them, Alexander reflected on how much his own life had changed since that December night. Taking custody of Sophie had transformed him from a successful but solitary businessman into a father, a protector, and ultimately, a complete human being. He had gained so much more than he had given. Sophie's laughter filled the empty spaces in his penthouse. Her curiosity about the world reminded him to see beauty in simple things. Her courage in the face of unimaginable trauma had taught him that resilience wasn't just about bouncing back, it was about becoming stronger and kinder because of what you had endured. That evening, after the guests had gone home and the gifts had been put away, Sophie knocked on Alexander's study door. "Daddy," she said, testing out the word she was now legally entitled to use. "Can I show you something?" She pulled out a school notebook and opened it to a page filled with her careful handwriting. At the top, in large letters, she had written, "My hero." Alexander took the notebook and read aloud, "My hero is my dad, Alexander Stone. He is brave and kind and smart. When I was in terrible danger, he didn't ignore me or pretend not to see. He fought to save me, even though it was hard and scary. He kept his promise to keep me safe. He taught me that some grown-ups can be trusted. He taught me that I deserve to be loved. He gave me a real family and a real home. He is the best daddy in the whole world, and I am lucky to be his daughter." Alexander's vision blurred as he finished reading. He pulled Sophie into his arms and held her tight, overwhelmed by the simple power of a child's love and trust. "I'm the lucky one, Sophie. You saved me just as much as I saved you." Sophie pulled back to look at him seriously. "How did I save you?" Alexander considered his words carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer she could understand. "I was living in a very big house all by myself, working all the time, never really connecting with people. I had money and success, but I didn't have love or purpose. You gave me both. You made me understand what it means to be a family." Sophie smiled and snuggled back into his arms. "So we saved each other." "Yes, sweetheart. We saved each other." Outside the windows of the penthouse, Chicago glittered in the darkness like a million tiny stars. Somewhere in the city, other children were suffering as Sophie had suffered. But tonight, this one child was safe, loved, and home. And that was enough to make the world a little brighter. As Alexander tucked Sophie into her bed, a real bed with clean sheets and soft pillows and stuffed animals that no one would ever take away, she reached for her father's pocket watch on the nightstand. "Will you help me wind it?" she asked, as she had every night for the past 18 months. Alexander took the tarnished silver watch and carefully wound the mechanism, listening to the familiar clicking sound. The watch had become a bridge between Sophie's past and present. A tangible connection to the father who had loved her first and the father who would love her always. "There," he said, handing it back to her. "Good for another day." Sophie held the watch to her ear and smiled at the steady ticking sound. "Daddy James would be happy that you take care of me now." "I think he would be," Alexander agreed. "And I think he would be very proud of the strong, brave young woman you're becoming. Will you always love me, even when I'm grown up and don't live here anymore?" Alexander kissed her forehead gently. "I will love you for the rest of my life, Sophie Stone. That's a promise I will never break." Sophie closed her eyes, still holding the pocket watch. "Good night, Daddy Alexander." "Good night, Daddy James. I love you both." Alexander turned off the light and tiptoed toward the door. Just before he closed it, Sophie's sleepy voice called out one more time, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Alexander paused in the doorway, his heart full of love and gratitude for the brave little girl who had changed his life so completely. "Thank you for not giving up on yourself, sweetheart. Sleep tight." He closed the door softly and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sound of a child breathing peacefully in her sleep. No nightmares tonight, no tears. Just the quiet contentment of a family at rest. The story that had begun with betrayal and cruelty had ended with love and justice. Victoria and Marcus Turner were in prison where they belonged. Sophie Turner Stone was safe, loved, and thriving. And Alexander Stone had discovered that sometimes the greatest fortune of all was the trust of a child, who had every reason not to trust anyone. In her bedroom, Sophie's father's pocket watch ticked steadily through the night, marking time for a future filled with endless possibilities.